In the summer of 1984, a man named Silvano boarded a cruise ship in the Mediterranean. He was 52, sharp-dressed, red-haired, the kind of man who noticed his own reflection and approved of it. Somewhere between the first night and the third, he began to sweat without reason. His pupils shrank to pinpricks. And when he closed his eyes to sleep, nothing happened. He didn't know it yet, but Silvano was the latest name in a family line that stretched back more than 200 years, a bloodline stalked by a disease so rare that doctors would later find only a few dozen families on Earth who carried it. A disease with a simple, almost absurd premise: it takes away your ability to sleep. And then it kills you. This isn't a story about a monster or a virus or a poison someone poured into a well. It's a story about what a family does when the thing hunting them is written into their own blood, and about the question that still divides that family today: if you could find out exactly how and when you're going to lose your mind, would you want to know? To understand Silvano, you have to go back further than his own lifetime, back to a doctor practicing in Venice in the late 1700s, whose nephew, a young aristocrat named Giuseppe, began complaining that he could no longer rest. Giuseppe grew agitated. He stopped eating properly. Within months, he was dead. At the time, there was no name for what had happened to him. The family called it something more familiar: bad luck. Sometimes, if they were feeling less charitable toward fate, they called it a curse. For nearly 2 centuries, that word curse did more work than any doctor could. It explained away a pattern that in hindsight was staring the family in the face. An uncle here, a cousin there, always in middle age, always the same, slow unraveling. Sweating, racing hearts, and above everything else, an inability to sleep that no remedy could touch. In an era before genetics, before brain scans, before anyone understood that a disease could be inherited silently for generations, without skipping a single one, curse wasn't a superstition. It was the only theory that fit the facts they had. By the time Silvano was a young man, the family had learned to live with a quiet dread that they rarely spoke about directly. Some relatives who fell ill were diagnosed with depression. Others were told they were simply exhausted, overworked, drinking too much coffee. The comfort of an ordinary diagnosis, anxiety, burnout, a nervous constitution, was in its own way a kind of hope. It meant rest or medication or time might fix it. Nobody wanted to be the one who said out loud what the family had quietly started to suspect: that whatever this was, it wasn't going to let go. There was another reason the pattern stayed hidden for so long. This was a large, sprawling Venetian family, and by the 20th century its branches had scattered and drifted out of touch the way large families sometimes do once they spread across cities and generations. A cousin who died strangely in one town rarely heard about an uncle who'd died the same way in another. Each death looked on its own like an isolated tragedy, a sad but unremarkable case of nerves or premature old age. It would take a family member marrying in from the outside with no memory of the old whispered warnings to finally start asking why the pattern kept repeating. Back on that cruise ship, Silvano didn't yet know what he was facing, only that something was deeply wrong. When the ship docked, he went home to Venice and then, at his daughter's urging, to the University of Bologna, to a sleep institute run by a young neurologist named Dr. Ignazio Roiter. Roiter had a personal reason to take the case seriously. He'd married into this family years earlier. He'd heard the whispers about a curse at holiday dinners for most of his adult life, and quietly dismissed them the way any trained physician would. Now, his wife's uncle was sitting in front of him, unable to sleep for weeks on end, and the easy explanations were falling apart one by one. The first theory was depression ruled out because antidepressants did nothing, and Silvano's mind stayed clear and articulate even as his body deteriorated. The second theory was a thyroid disorder ruled out by blood work. The third was a panic or anxiety disorder ruled out because sedatives that should have knocked out any anxious patient barely touched him. Frustrated and increasingly unsettled, Roiter ran a routine overnight EEG to record Silvano's brain activity. It was meant to last a few minutes. He let it run for half an hour instead. What came out the other end was 30 feet of paper and a pattern that didn't correspond to sleep and didn't correspond to being awake either. It didn't exist anywhere in the medical literature Roiter had ever read. Over the following months, a colleague of Roiter's, Dr. Pietro Cortelli, kept a camera running on Silvano through the night, documenting a decline that read like something out of a fever dream rather than a hospital chart. Silvano's pupils stayed constricted. He sweated through his sheets with no fever to explain it. And strangest of all, in what should have been his deepest hours of rest, he was recorded miming ordinary gestures with his hands combing his hair, buttoning a shirt caught in some unnamed passage between sleep and waking that his body could no longer complete in either direction. Whatever this was, it wasn't in any textbook. And somewhere in that family's history, an answer had already been buried once before waiting 200 years to be dug back up. Roiter did something almost unheard of. For the time, he began quietly researching his own wife's family tree tracing, baptism, and death records held in Catholic parish houses across the Veneto, piecing together a genealogy of unexplained deaths stretching back to that Venetian doctor and his nephew Giuseppe in the 1700s. Slowly, a devastating shape emerged. This wasn't isolated bad luck striking at random. It was a single thread pulled taut across 9 generations. Silvano died in 1984, 4 months after his first symptoms appeared. Before he died, he asked that his brain be sent to science rather than the family plot. It was flown to a neuropathologist named Dr. Pierluigi Gambetti in Cleveland, packed carefully to survive customs. Under the microscope, Gambetti found something eerily familiar, tiny holes riddling the brain tissue like a sponge, a pattern that resembled a disease called Creutzfeldt-Jakob, the human relative of what the world would soon know as mad cow disease. The family hadn't been cursed. They'd been carrying a misfolded protein a prion passed silently from parent to child generation after generation, waiting decades before it woke up and began, quite literally, dismantling the part of the brain that lets a human being rest. Roiter's search through parish birth and death registers eventually connected more than 40 relatives across the family tree, scattered over 2 centuries, almost all of them dying in the same slow, sleepless way in middle age. 2 of them, a generation after Silvano, developed a slightly different version of the illness, one that showed up on brain scans looking closer to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease than to what Silvano had experienced. It was the first hint that this wasn't one disease wearing one face, but a single genetic fault capable of expressing itself in more than one form depending on which parent had passed it down. The disease finally had a name: fatal familial insomnia. And its discovery didn't stay isolated to one Venetian bloodline. The same misfolded prion protein was already being studied on the other side of the world in cases of mad cow disease in British cattle and in a strange fatal illness called kuru that had devastated a community in Papua New Guinea decades earlier. 3 seemingly unconnected mysteries on 3 continents turned out to be variations on the same rogue molecule. The nightmare that had stalked one quiet Venetian family for 2 centuries was finally unmasked as a global killer. In 1997, the scientist who first proposed that a protein alone with no virus, no bacteria could cause disease and pass it on, Dr. Stanley Prusiner, was awarded the Nobel Prize. For Silvano's family, the science arrived only after answering one question and opening another, far harder one. A genetic test now exists. Anyone descended from that line can find out with near certainty whether they carry the mutation that will eventually take their sleep and then their life. Roughly half of them will. Researchers who continued studying the disease after Silvano's death eventually identified roughly 40 families worldwide known to carry the mutation, with estimates suggesting as many as 200 families may carry it without yet knowing it. Each one, it turns out, having developed the same rare genetic fault independently at some point in their own family's past entirely by chance. And here is where the story stops being about a rare disease and becomes something closer to a mirror. Faced with a test that could tell them their future, most of the family has chosen not to look. not because they doubt the science, but because knowing changes nothing about the outcome and takes away the one thing that made the decades in between bearable, the uncertainty. Some have taken the test anyway, needing to know for the sake of their own children. Others have built entire lives around a question they've decided never to answer. It's a decision that has quietly become familiar to families facing other inherited conditions, Huntington's disease among them, where medicine can now tell you your fate long before your body ever tries to. The instruments have improved. The dilemma at the center of it hasn't moved an inch. Silvano's brain is still preserved in a laboratory today, one of the reasons scientists understand this disease at all. Somewhere in Italy, his descendants are living ordinary lives, working, raising children, falling asleep most nights without a second thought, caring or not caring an answer they may never choose to open. If you knew exactly how your story ended, would you still want to hear it?